Hello, welcome to this strange lecture. What I'm going to do today is I'm just going to go through each section of the handout, and I will talk about a little bit about each of them as a kind of repetition or whatever you like, but I will do it in a strange manner. I will take one country as a specific thing that goes through the lecture, and that country is going to be Zimbabwe. And there's more than one reason why I've chosen Zimbabwe. But Zimbabwe is turning 40 years since independence this week. It's actually on Saturday, April 18. So it was established as a separate country or as an independent country in 18 April 1980. And that was, so it's one way to sort of mark the 40 years of, I would say, a tragic development. But I do it just to show for you, I hope, some of the relevance of the small things that we have taught in class. So let me tell you a little bit about the background, or remind you, I guess, about the background of the country. And then I go through the list and say, is this relevant to understand this and this and this for Zimbabwe? So Zimbabwe was initially Rhodesia. It was sort of occupied or settler colony by the British. It was Cecil Rhodes who sort of invaded the country and fenced off the local population and grabbed the best land in the area. And reserved it for white settlers. So I think it's correct to say they occupied, I think, half of the land of what was then called South Rhodesia. And it was definitely the best land. So in around 1980, then I think 6,000 white farmers owned all the good land in Zimbabwe. And this is 6,000 landowners compared to a size of the country that is today, I think, 18 million people. So this is a really small group compared to the vast population of the country as a whole. Of course, there were more white people than these 6,000 big landowners. There were many professionals, white and so on. The South Rhodesia, or later it was just called Rhodesia, was run as an apartheid state. It was run by Ian Smith, a very brute dictatorship. He had very racist opinions about Africans. He ran the country just like an apartheid state at its worst, with huge discrimination, violence used against the population, no rights, no education for blacks, and so on. So the civil war, or the fight for freedom, I think is a better term for what happened, started in the 1970s, and there were two movements in the country fighting for independence. One was ZANU, and that was headed by Robert Mugabe, and the other one was ZAPU, that was headed by Joshua Nkomo, a big fat guy that you may have seen in pictures. Robert Mugabe, he looked a little bit more impressive, at least on pictures. And they fought from different parts of the countries, but they united in the final round, and the country became independent in 1980, as I said. Before that, Ian Smith, the previous leader of the country, has sort of declared unilaterally that Rhodesia was independent of the Brits. That it was called unilateral declaration of independence, which was very unpopular in England, and there was a boycott organized against Rhodesia. So the freedom fighters in Zimbabwe, they tried to sort of get the support from England and England tried to boycott Ian Smith. So there was a very strange alliance. Even though the settlers came from England, there was a conflict between the settlers and England United. And then the country became independent, as I said, and it was just a few years with very happy, high economic growth, good atmosphere in Zimbabwe and in Harare, the capital. It used to be called Salisbury. Now it changed to the African name Harare. The first 2 years, for example, they had a very high economic growth. I think the two first years, all in all, they had an economic growth of 24% altogether, which is a tremendously high. But of course, it came from an atmosphere of war and into a peace that can create a catch-up that is sufficiently high to have an economic growth of 24%. But then problems emerged. There was a conflict from the start between the two organizations, the SANU and the SAPU, and there was also a sort of ethnic division between the two. Robert Mugabe, he's a Shona, and Joshua Nkomo, he is a Nebele, and Nebele is more population more south in the country, and Bulawayo is their main city, and Matabeleland is the main area, while the Shona is more a dominant group in the country, and a much bigger group, and they are located more on, say, the rest of the country, and with the headquarters being Harare. So there was, after they demobilized the armies of the two sides, then of course people have been fighting in the armies. They demanded some compensation for the work they have done, and they got nothing. And the soldiers that used to fight for Joshua Nkomo started to protest against that they were not given what they were promised, and there were demonstrations in Matabeleland, and the government, which were headed by Robert Mugabe as the prime minister, he was called at that time. So he had a very brute attack on the protesters in Matabeleland. To make a long story short, actually the whole thing went on from 1983 to 1987, and it ended actually by the government with Mugabe in charge, sort of starving out, creating a local famine up in Matabeleland, and around 20,000 people died. That's the estimator. So this was never resolved, and people in Matabeleland, of course, never forgot about these things, and so that was a bad event throughout. But then the opposition against Robert Mugabe became very weak after this event in Matabeleland, and in 1987 he merged the two parties into one, and from then on it was basically a one-party dictatorship in Zimbabwe, headed now by Mugabe, who later on took the name or the title as being the president, not only the prime minister, but the president of Zimbabwe. Nkomo sort of didn't play a political role after that. I think he was very bitter, the older guy, so he's out of the picture. So, but something that entered this political scene in Zimbabwe was the movement of democratic change. They came in the late 19th, and they became the main opposition. When you hear about the opposition in Zimbabwe today, that is the movement for democratic change. And I think they were more social democratic in attitude. They have been visiting Norway several times, some of the leaders there, and they have been at seminars at the university, and some of us have met them. Both Halvor and I know some of the people in MDC, as it is called. So let me talk now. So this is more sort of the broad framework about it. If you think about some of the things that are sort of crucial to development in the broad picture, then you would think about inequality, you would think about poverty, you would think about corruption, you would think about conflict, you would think about violence, you would think about healthcare. All these things are very central in the history of Zimbabwe. The country was rather, among the poor countries in the world, it was a rather better off country, a rich country in the sense that it produced more food than they ate. So it was a sort of a supplier of food, in particular of maize, that they exported. I'm saying this because today they are on the brink of having a huge famine. They're going to be 6 million people are threatened by a famine in Zimbabwe because they have run down the whole agriculture sector, which is basically in a huge catastrophe. And they try now to get some of the white farmers back, not necessarily because the whites are much better, but at least they knew how to run the big farms, and many of them have sort of left the country. There used to be 500,000 whites in Zimbabwe. Last time I was there, together with Halvor Melum, I think we sort of found statistics indicating that there were 30,000 whites. When you move around in Harare, you are the only white person in the street, and they look at you as you are a sort of a very strange person moving around. In earlier visits in the 80s and so on, there were black and whites going in the streets, and they mixed in a natural way. Now it's completely segregated. The 30,000 left, they are living by themselves, and there's a mistrust of enormous amount between the two groups. One thing that has been sort of going through all the time has been the promise by the government of a land reform. So when the people fight for independence in Zimbabwe, they were fighting for land and jobs, not for sort of majority rule by the blacks, because that's an abstraction. What they actually fought for was land and titles to the land. Many of them have been sort of agriculture workers. No, they maybe had the prospect of owning their own farm and live off that farm. Nothing of that happened in the beginning. Because the government in Zimbabwe signed an agreement that they shouldn't touch the land for 10 years. It was called the Lancaster House Agreement. And for 10 years, there were no implementation at all of the promise of a land reform. But then it started, in 1992, the land reform started, but then it was discovered immediately that some of the land didn't go to poor people. It went to ministers, it went to the friends of the government, and many rich people who became rich in Zimbabwe sort of claimed that you have to be a close ally to the party in order to get rich. So when we talk about some of the things about parasites, that's a typical example of parasites inside the public sector, that they can gain access to land, gain access to resources by occupying positions in the state apparatus, either as a bureaucrat or as a politician or as a close friend of the government. Some of these guys, they are both in the private sector and in the state administration, sort of living off the advantages that they can get by being a friend of the government. So this goes through a lot of the stories that I'm going to tell. Let's now move to the list. I have the list of the topics here. I just taken the list from the handout. The first item in the handout that we discussed is diminishing return to scale. That's just a definition, but of course in all activities that we discuss in Zimbabwe or in any actually developing countries where agriculture is important, and diminishing return to scale is important in itself. So I don't repeat that, but that is at the bottom of what they're going to say. The tragedy of the commons, our next topic. In the handout, that is illustrated by the free movement of workers across areas. So then you got an access entry into areas where you don't have private property rights, because you have free access and people will move into that area as long as that is beneficial to them. Of course, in the old history of the area where Zimbabwe is now, and people moved around a lot, and they didn't have common property rights, and the sort of common land was considered to be. And when the sort of settlers came, they privatized the land and they're claiming property rights to that. Maybe that increased efficiency, as we have discussed several places in during the course, but it was definitely at the cost of a declining real income for the poor peasants. Maybe there were some of them were not. Maybe they were hired as labor to the new white farms that produce tobacco to a high degree, and maize, as I said. There's also some other crops, vegetables and so on. But the two main crops in Zimbabwe are tobacco and maize. The American name for maize is corn. So if you read that, that is the same. It's not corn in the European sense, but in the American sense. So the tragedy of the commons actually were a tragedy in two ways for the Zimbabweans, or for the people in the area when the settlers came. That it was very difficult to defend the property rights of common property, because then you have to coordinate. If you have a sort of own your own plot, then you defend it much better than if you have a sort of common access to the area. That was one part of the tragedy. Another part of the tragedy is that maybe the best land was sort of overpopulated by people, because they were moving in as long as the average productivity was higher there, and the higher they can earn more of using the land that was good compared to the land that was bad. So maybe there also was a tragedy in that sense. Tragedy is a strong word, but that's a word that's normally used about this misallocation of labor across land area with different quality. We have then a section about alternative employment. That's just to say that if you have an alternative employment and you do the best out of the situation, the alternative employment is a break, in a sense, for the movement of people into an area with common ownership to land. So if you have better opportunities elsewhere, of course, then not so many people go into the common wasteland. The common land in Zimbabwe today is wasteland, because all the good high quality land is occupied basically by white, but no to some extent taken over by blacks. So that is the role of alternative employment. I sometimes get a reminder on my screen. I hope you don't see that. So now we are down to point 4. I mentioned that again, that private ownership means that you economize with the use of labor, because you now have to pay a wage for that, and you live as a private owner of the land. You live on the surplus, basically the average productivity of the land minus the wage that you pay for hired agricultural workers, times the number of workers. That's the profit, the surplus of the land, and you've seen many expositions of that during the class. So the basic principle of profit maximizing employment decision is that you would hire more worker as long as the marginal productivity of the new hires are higher than the wage that you're going to pay them. But compared to common ownership, you fence off workers in order to increase the surplus going to the owner. Sharecropping, if you ask, that's the 5th point on the list. If you ask somebody whether there's a lot of sharecropping in Africa. I think most people would say no, but that's because they take it too literally. Sharecropping means, literally taken, that you farm the land and you pay the landowner by a share of the output, say 50% of the output. That is sharecropping, the essence of sharecropping. That has been used a lot in Asian countries. It was used a lot in European countries. It was dominate parts of North American agriculture. So it was used widely all over the world, but not so much in Africa. And the reason was that Africa was initially rather rich in land. So the scarcity of land didn't sort of show up in that they established rental arrangement for land. But of course, after the population growth and so on, then become competition for scarce resources, land being very important scarce resources also in Africa after a while. But what the reason, the relevance of sharecropping in Zimbabwe today is actually you will see a lot of, not a lot of, but some joint ventures taking back the land that was taken from the whites, and the whites left the country. I know they try to run this land as a joint venture by the new black owner, very often a privileged black owner, a friend of the government, joined as a joint venture together with black workers and a white previous landowner coming back, say that he moved to another African country or back to England or whatever, coming back doing these things. That's also some of them actually some of the whites went to Australia after the conflict in Zimbabwe. But it's actually that these leasing arrangement where you have joint venture that looks very sort of modern and market oriented is basically a form of sharecropping. So it's re-emerging in a new form, and as a crisis, as a remedy of the crisis that you produce too little agriculture output, and as I said, so little that maybe 6 million people are in danger of a famine in Zimbabwe today. So sharecropping is of relevance, but it isn't a dominant mood. But it is, even in a country like Zimbabwe, we can find some of these things that we have discussed when we took up sharecropping. The sixth point on the list is about the labor market. African labor markets are very strange, and also it's the same with the labor market in Zimbabwe. There are some migrant labor that move into the city, and that is covered by point 7 on the list, where we sort of discussed, among other things, this Haros Todaro mechanism. As long as the prospects of moving into the city are better than staying on the countryside, you do that. And after the process has gone on for some while, then you end up in a situation where there's some sort of equality between the prospect of staying in the rural areas and the prospect of moving into the city. The local labor markets in a country like Zimbabwe is very much dominated by the informal market. You have no contract. Maybe you work for a daily wage. You can be attached in the urban areas to an employer, but you are no guarantee that you are hired the next day. In the rural area, there's also a labor market. It used to be a labor market for the big white commercial farmers. Then you were more attached to the specific employer. You learned more about tilling the land at the local area. So you had knowledge about that. And therefore, if there was a land reform, the land should be given to these workers, not to the privileged people with good contacts in Harare, because they knew how to do it, and they have been working there for a long time. But the labor market are very informal in most African setups. Unionized workers, there are some unions in Zimbabwe, but these are very privileged groups. because they have very formal jobs in the modern industry or manufacturing industries. They're not privileged in our sense of the word, but they are privileged in comparing them to others in Africa. So I mentioned this movement for democratic change in Zimbabwe. They had the leader there, Swangarai is his name. He was a union leader before he became a politician, and a very popular union leader, actually. So this is what I'm going to just say about 6 and 7. There are very interesting topics in a country like Zimbabwe to study with the small tools that we presented, more or less as an introduction to a more fascinating area of economics that deals more formally with these things, maybe as a specialty. So then I jump all the way to point 8 on the list, comparative advantage. That is a topic from international trade. And we discussed to illustrate the use of these tools that we like you to learn in the class. We discussed comparative advantage to identify losers and gainers from access to free trade in the world market. And one event of interest in the history of Zimbabwe is this unilateral declaration of independence, because at that time, that was in 1965 under apartheid with Ian Smith, when he declared independence of the Brits. Then he was boycotted, as I mentioned. And being boycotted meant that they had to rely much more on production in the home country. So from 1965 till 1979, there was actually they tried to produce some of this was just bad imitations of products that they have seen in other countries, but they were not allowed to import that because they were boycotted by many other countries, say in Europe and elsewhere. So they had to make their own substitutes. But when Mugabe and his government took over in 1980, he inherited actually an economy that had tried out many things. They had built up experience in producing a huge variety of products because of this boycott. So in that sense, it was the opposite. They sort of they didn't experience the comparative advantage. They didn't experience the gains from specialization in the recent 15 years of apartheid in Zimbabwe. And as a consequence, they had half good manufacturing industries that they could build up when the country was not discriminated or boycotted anymore from the 1980s and onwards. Because the new government of Mugabe was accepted immediately by the world community, and actually there was a flow into the country of foreign aid. So unfortunately, in the beginning they tried to utilize some of these advantages when they opened up for free trade again, so they could gain by importing cheaper goods and inputs that they needed and import machinery and so on. But after a short while, the whole thing got stuck because there was too much conflict, too much corruption inside the country. I return to that. Let's now look at this, what we discussed under point 9, as you can see here on the list. Point 9, growth and capital accumulation. I think Zimbabwe was in a good position actually to gain from this. They did, after, at least in the beginning, after apartheid was over, they didn't have this big upper class that sort of live on a high consumption, not willing to save and invest because they were just basically living on of surplus and rents from the land they owned. Because the new government sort of had, many thought, this spirit of development and know they should take off and have a high economic growth. It didn't happen because instead of having this big upper class that was sort of eating up the surplus of the country, they got, instead of conflict inside among groups in societies, as it spoiled some of the surpluses that otherwise could have been invested. For example, the conflict between the SAPU and SANU, as I mentioned, and the conflict, the mistrust of people in Matabeleland and so on, that led, there was very little investment here because they didn't trust that this was a good enough stability of the regime, and there was, after a while at least, a suspicion in the international community of foreign investors that this was not a good country to invest in. There was some tourist investment in that period because Zimbabwe is an extremely beautiful country, and they got some with wildlife and all these things that you can sell for tourists, but they never succeeded in making this into a big business. So I think growth and capital accumulation stagnated after a while, and also because the country was not run very well. So if you're going to import certain things, you must also be able to export something to pay for these imports. And Zimbabwe became less and less able to do so, in part because of bad governance, corruption, and political conflicts. Point 10 on the list in the handout, then we discussed a welfare state for the poor, sort of emphasizing that it would be good to have a welfare state for the poor in poor countries, and it is possible to develop one because it is beneficial to invest in people's health. It is profitable to invest in people's education. It is beneficial to have security in the country, to be insured against droughts and bad harvests. So what did happen during the first 10 years, for example? There was a huge schooling reform in Zimbabwe. So they increased schooling a lot, but they increased more the access to school, and the supply of teachers could cover. So the supply of teachers was actually the limiting factor. And so when families, households sent their kids to school, very often the teacher was not there. And when he was there, maybe he didn't know exactly what to teach. Maybe he didn't have a proper education himself. Very often it was a he, actually. Teachers in school who doesn't know what they're going to do easily become authoritarian, and that's what happened in many schools, in particular in rural areas, that they had authoritarian teachers that showed up when they didn't when it fit them, and many students, young students, get a poorly education. There was some foreign assistance, people moving to Zimbabwe to be a teacher there for 2 or 3 years. I think some of them did a good job, and I think also many teachers in Zimbabwe, being Zimbabweans, did a good job as well. But there were enough of those who did not perform very well, and that destroy actually the building up of what could have been a good start of a welfare state. There were health stations in the rural areas in Zimbabwe. I remember once we visited one, and when we talked to in one of these health stations, he said the way he operated, sort of taking operations on people, surgery. So then we sort of asked him, so you are educated for that? No, he was just a nurse, but he was doing operations or surgery like that you would sort of require extra education for in Europe. Let's now dwell a little bit by point 11, parasites and joint economics, poverty traps. I don't repeat everything we said there, but the basic principle that we discussed for parasites in that in this lecture that covered point 11 on the list is basically how you can get access to income by moving, say, into public sector, into the government, into the state apparatus, and sort of suck out rents and surplus from that power position itself. If you are sort of completely opportunistic, you don't care whether you are a private businessman or a farmer or as you only go for the earnings, then there was a huge entry into the public sector in Zimbabwe, and in order to get access to income from the state. And also when the land reform started, to get privileged land property allocated to yourself, as I mentioned. So these things that we discussed with parasites and joint economics, that joint economics was basically how the market for development of industrialization, say, created more profitability for new entrepreneurs. This sort of relationship between parasites and producers that we discussed, I think, is highly relevant to the experience of Zimbabwe. It's relevant. It's relevant because you had a lot of people making that comparison, and you had a lot of people who sort of were straddling that they have one leg in the public sector and one leg in the private sector, using the position in the public sector to get more or less illegal advantages from the state. This is typical for African countries and very typical for Zimbabwe, unfortunately, both in the 80s and the 90s and even maybe more so in after 2000. So this is also related to corruption that we discussed in section 2. It's more political corruption than bureaucratic corruption, but it can also be bureaucratic corruption in Zimbabwe. But it's more these bending of rules, getting favors by the government because you are one of their friends and so on. So these 11 and 12, I would say, are both highly relevant for explaining the failure of the governance of Zimbabwe, explaining why Zimbabwe failed in spite of being a very high productivity, have the potential of being a high productivity country in Africa. It ended up really poor today. So 11 and 12 is highly relevant. We didn't discuss so much political corruption, but it's, you know, when the top leadership in the country is corrupt, then you have nobody to go to if you have complaints about unfair deals. Say the allocation of land during the land reforms in Zimbabwe, that you took land from white landowners that unfairly had taken the land way back in history, and now the black were taking it back, but they were giving by creating a new black upper class. If you have a top leadership in the country, like in the case of Mugabe, who himself was a corrupt person, then you have nobody to complain to. I think the juridical, the court system was the last thing to be corrupted in Zimbabwe. You can still go to the courts, but then Mugabe say, who cares about the court? The court can't decide that a white person have any right towards me. I'm the one who decides. I'm the one, and then he used a very nationalistic rhetoric that he was the leader. Actually, he reminds me very much about Donald Trump in the US. The way he speaks, the way he approaches people, the rhetoric that he uses. He can use a sort of Zimbabwe is great, Zimbabwe is for Africans, Zimbabwe for Zambians, Zimbabweans, just like Trump saying America for Americans, America is great, and all these things that we are sick and tired of hearing. Okay, then let me then move to, I go down one page. Oh, I lost the last one. I'm sorry. No, it's there. I'm sorry. I just didn't see it. The 13 entry on the list, that's poverty, land distribution, and basic income. It's somewhat repetitious of something that we have discussed early on, but it is also that privatization of land can create poverty. A sharing of land can eliminate poverty. There are some basic links between land sharing, land reform, and basic income, providing a basic income to everybody. And we discussed some of these things that they can be achieved in different ways. Applied in the Zimbabwean case, then the whole land reform in Zimbabwe was more or less a betrayal of the poor. It was a betrayal in the poor in the sense that there was land grabbing, and you fenced off the basic tillers of the country that used to provide the food by being agriculture workers on the white farms. Those were the workers that should get the land. They never got it, at least at a very, very low scale. They got it. Now they try to redo some of the mistakes. As you know, there was a coup in Zimbabwe in 2017, where it was a coup inside the party. They just took the power away from Robert Mugabe and placed it in the hands of the new president, Emerson Mnangagwa. I can't pronounce his last name, so we call him just Emerson. That's his first name. He has a terrible nickname. He is the crocodile. He was actually one of the worst in the ZAPU army when they had this conflict, like killing 20,000 people up in Matabeleland. He was one of the main leaders for that, a very close ally to Robert Mugabe. So it's a kind of strange that he had a coup and replaced Mugabe. But Mugabe is a very old man. In 1917, he was 91 years old. He's now 94. He is flying back and forth to Korea to get a checkup on his health. He doesn't trust the health system that he himself created for Zimbabwe. So he is obviously too valuable a person to use that other people in Zimbabwe has to use. But they try, I think, to get the country on a more solid footing. But I think what Zimbabwe needs is more political competition, more accountability for the population, more and better governance. And it is the experience from many other parts of the developing world that when you have competition, then you can redo some of the bad things. When you have competition on the political arena, economists are emphasizing competition in a market arena. That may or may not be a good thing, but political competition, I think, political competition makes politicians more accountable, more responding to the needs of the poor, and that's what Zimbabweans need, and many other countries need. So I went through this list just to tell you that some of the things are stylized, technical maybe for some of you. For others of you, they are very easily accessible because you have some of this in different contexts. It's just a different application of it. But for some of you, this is something that you see for the first time. But think about some of that I think every chapter in this handout that we produced, I just picked Zimbabwe because I know something about Zimbabwe, and it is the 40-year anniversary of the country as an independent country on Saturday. So, but I can say just picking that country and just speaking about my knowledge of the country makes every point on the list of relevance. I hope you can do some similar things with a country that you know or that you are interested in, and that some of these things can be useful after you finish your exam. Okay, I'm going to say good luck. We're going to come back a little bit, both Halvor and I think, to talk a little bit about the exam in the final lecture for you. Okay, talk to you soon, guys. Have a nice weekend. Bye.